There's a particular kind of conversation that happens in emergency medicine that never quite stops being frustrating, no matter how many times you have it. A patient comes in with a blood pressure reading that's clearly too high, sitting somewhere around 160 over 95, sometimes higher. And so you ask the obvious questions. What does your diet look like? Pretty clean, they tell you. Lots of vegetables, home-cooked food most nights, barely any salt. What about exercise? I walk most days, they say. 5 or 6,000 steps at least. You look at their medication list and find they're already on something for blood pressure, a tablet they've been taking faithfully every morning, and it's clearly not doing enough. And you're standing there looking at someone who, on paper, is doing everything the health guidelines would tell them to do, and their blood pressure is still climbing. What makes this so genuinely difficult, both for the clinician and for the patient, is that they aren't being misleading. They've actually followed the advice. They reduced the sodium. They added the movement. They cut out the takeaways and the processed foods. They showed up for the lifestyle changes that were supposed to make the difference. And the expected reward, blood pressure that comes back down to a healthy range, simply hasn't arrived. So they doubled down. They cut salt even more aggressively. They had another walk. They eat even more carefully. And still the numbers don't move in the way they should. What's happening to these patients, and there are far more of them than most people realize, is that the dietary and lifestyle changes they've made are addressing one part of the blood pressure equation while an entirely different mechanism continues to run unchecked in the background. A hormonal system that activates multiple times throughout each day is quietly instructing the kidneys to hold on to sodium, regardless of how little salt is coming in through the diet. The kidneys don't receive that instruction from the salt shaker. They receive it from a hormone. And unless that hormone is being properly managed, not just in terms of how much of it is produced, but in terms of when it rises and when it's allowed to fall, the blood pressure problem persists no matter how many other boxes are ticked. That hormone is insulin. And the conversation around insulin has almost entirely focused on quantity. How much is being produced, whether the body has become resistant to it, whether the pancreas is keeping up with demand. All of that matters. But when it comes specifically to blood pressure, what matters just as much and possibly more is the pattern of insulin secretion across the day. Whether it rises and falls in the way it was designed to, or whether it stays elevated almost continuously from morning until late at night. Insulin is meant to be pulsatile. It spikes in response to eating, rises to move glucose into cells, does its job, and then drops back down to a low baseline once the meal has been processed. That rise and fall pattern isn't just about blood sugar. It carries information to multiple organ systems throughout the body. When insulin rises, it sends a signal to the kidneys to retain sodium. It activates the sympathetic nervous system, the branch of the nervous body that controls the stress response and keeps systems in a state of heightened readiness. It puts the blood vessels into a particular mode of responsiveness. All of this is completely appropriate in the context of a meal when the body needs to direct resources toward digestion and nutrient processing. The design is sensible. The problem is what happens when that rise never resolves. When insulin stays elevated not for 2 or 3 hours after a meal, but for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours continuously throughout the day. Modern eating habits have made this the default for a huge number of people. Breakfast shortly after waking. A mid-morning snack because that's become standard. Lunch. Something in the afternoon to keep energy levels up. Dinner. Something in the evening while watching television. Each of these occasions, even when the food choices are genuinely healthy, whole grains, fruit, nuts, lean protein, triggers an insulin response. And because these occasions are spaced closely enough together, insulin from one meal hasn't fully returned to baseline before the next eating occasion arrives and sends it back up again. What that creates over days, weeks, and months is a state of chronic low-grade insulin elevation. Not high enough to register as diabetes on a standard blood test. Not high enough to cause noticeable symptoms in daily life, but high enough to fundamentally alter how the kidneys, the blood vessels, and the autonomic nervous system behave across time. When the kidneys receive a continuous insulin signal, they interpret it as a continuous instruction to hold onto sodium. This happens through a very specific mechanism within the kidney's filtering units. Insulin directly influences sodium reabsorption in the structures responsible for reclaiming filter material back into the bloodstream. It increases the activity of channels in the kidney's collecting tubes that pull sodium back before it can be excreted. This isn't a malfunction. It's the system working exactly as designed, but in a context for which it was never designed. The mechanism was built for a world where eating was intermittent, where hours passed between meals, where insulin had plenty of time to fall back to baseline before rising again. In that context, the temporary sodium retention triggered by eating is just that, temporary, self-correcting, harmless over the long term. But when the signal never stops, the retention never stops either. The kidneys stay locked in a holding pattern, retaining sodium continuously regardless of how little is being consumed through the diet. This is why some people can follow a very strict low-sodium approach and still find their blood pressure unmoved. The tap is still running, reducing what flows and helps a little, but it can't empty a bathtub with the drain blocked. This also explains something that puzzles many people who monitor their own blood pressure at home. They notice that readings are higher in the morning than in the evening, or that the numbers seem to spike without any obvious trigger. No stress, no exertion, no salty meal. What's actually happening in many of these cases is that insulin levels are fluctuating in ways that directly affect how the kidney is behaving at any given time. A small snack before bed, something as wholesome as a piece of fruit or a handful of nuts, keeps insulin elevated for several hours after the person falls asleep. That means the kidneys are still retaining sodium through the night. The sympathetic nervous system isn't fully downregulating. The blood vessels aren't getting the overnight recovery period they need. And the person wakes up the next morning already sitting at an elevated pressure, wondering why it happens every single day despite everything they're doing right. There's a further layer to this that makes it even more difficult to identify by looking at someone from the outside. Most of the metrics we use to assess metabolic health, body weight, body mass index, physical appearance, whether someone looks fit, turn out to be poor proxies for what's actually happening inside. There's a meaningful subset of people who sit at a perfectly normal body weight, who exercise regularly, who look every bit the picture of health, but who carry excess fat around their internal organs, around the liver and the structures of the abdominal cavity, in quantities that standard measurements simply don't detect. This visceral fat, unlike the subcutaneous fat that sits just beneath the skin, is metabolically active. It releases inflammatory signals. It directly interferes with how the liver processes insulin. It contributes to a state of insulin resistance in which the pancreas has to produce larger quantities of insulin to achieve the same level of blood sugar control, which means insulin levels run chronically higher, which means all of the downstream effects on the kidneys, the nervous system, and the blood vessels are amplified. This pattern is particularly common in people going through hormonal transitions, particularly women during and after the menopause, when body composition can shift significantly even without any change in overall weight. It shows up frequently in people who are chronically sleep-deprived, since poor sleep independently accelerates visceral fat accumulation and degrades insulin sensitivity, even when calorie intake is carefully controlled. It can develop gradually in people who consume moderate amounts of alcohol regularly, since alcohol is processed through the liver in ways that promote fat accumulation in that organ. Chronic stress contributes by elevating cortisol, which preferentially deposits fat in the visceral compartment rather than beneath the skin. All of these factors, and often several of them combined, can create a situation where someone who genuinely looks and feels healthy is running on hormonal settings that are quietly pushing blood pressure upward with every passing year. What this means in practical terms is that the most important mistake many health-conscious people make when it comes to blood pressure has nothing to do with what they eat. It has to do with when. More specifically, it has to do with the frequency of eating throughout the day and whether there is ever a long enough window without eating for insulin to genuinely return to a low baseline. Not slightly lower than it was an hour ago. Actually low. Back to a level where the kidneys receive the signal to release sodium, where the sympathetic nervous system can downregulate, where the blood vessels can recover their flexibility, where the physiological reset that's supposed to happen between eating occasions can actually occur. Grazing, the habit of eating small amounts throughout the day, often promoted as a way of keeping energy levels stable or maintaining a healthy metabolism, is particularly problematic in this context. Each small eating occasion, regardless of how healthy the food is, triggers an insulin response. When those occasions are frequent enough, insulin never falls far enough to allow the body's pressure-regulating systems to reset. The same applies to liquid calories that often don't register as proper meals. A smoothie in the morning, a protein shake after exercise, a glass of fruit juice at lunch, a couple of glasses of wine in the evening. From a nutritional standpoint, some of these might be perfectly reasonable choices. From an insulin standpoint, they're all stimuli. They all keep the elevated state going. And because they're liquid, they're absorbed quickly, which can actually produce sharper insulin spikes with a longer tail of elevated levels after the drink has been finished. Late-night eating deserves particular attention because of what happens during sleep. Sleep is not simply rest. It's a period of active hormonal recalibration. Growth hormone rises. Cortisol drops to its lowest point. Insulin sensitivity improves significantly with adequate, well-timed sleep and deteriorates sharply without it. When food is consumed close to bedtime, insulin remains elevated for several hours into what should be a period of deep metabolic recovery. The kidneys continue to retain sodium through the night. The sympathetic nervous system doesn't fully downregulate. Blood vessels don't get the extended relaxation they need. Sleep research has shown that even a relatively short stretch of insufficient sleep reduces insulin sensitivity substantially in otherwise healthy adults. And when that becomes a chronic pattern, the baseline level of insulin the body requires to manage blood sugar rises correspondingly, with all the downstream effects on blood pressure that follow. The encouraging part of all of this, and it is genuinely encouraging, is how quickly things can shift once the underlying hormonal driver is addressed. The body is not particularly interested in holding blood pressure high for its own sake. When the hormonal environment changes, the physiology follows. Patients who have made no changes to what they eat, who haven't altered their exercise routine, who are still taking the same medications, but who have simply narrowed their eating to a window of 8 to 10 hours during the day, cutting out evening snacking, having their first meal later in the morning, eliminating drinks that stimulate insulin between meals, often see their blood pressure respond within a matter of weeks. That's the kidneys finally getting the signal to release sodium. That's the sympathetic nervous system receiving permission to stand down. That's the blood vessel lining recovering its capacity to produce the compounds that allow it to relax and dilate properly. Perhaps most practically useful is what happens to medication when this approach is taken. Antihypertensive drugs work by blocking or interfering with specific mechanisms that raise blood pressure. But when the root hormonal driver is still present, when insulin is elevated for 14 hours a day and the kidneys are receiving a continuous retention signal, those medications are constantly working against an upstream force. They can suppress the symptoms, but they can't neutralize the cause. When the insulin environment is corrected, medications that weren't fully controlling the blood pressure often become effective at the same dose, sometimes more effective than they were before. The boat can be bailed out efficiently once someone stops pouring water into it. The approach that tends to work best isn't one of extreme restriction or dramatic intervention. It doesn't require fasting for extended periods or eliminating entire food groups. What it requires is creating a genuine daily window, ideally somewhere between 8 and 12 hours, during which nothing is consumed that triggers an insulin response. For most people, this means consolidating meals, removing snacks between them, finishing the last meal of the day at a reasonable hour, and not eating again until the following morning. The exact structure matters far less than the principle embodies, giving the hormonal system time to reset completely every single day so that the downstream effects on the kidneys, the nervous system, the blood vessels, the heart can resolve on their own, as they are entirely capable of doing when the conditions finally allow it. Blood pressure that stays high despite doing all the right things is not evidence of failure. It's not a sign that someone's body is broken beyond repair or that medication is the only path forward. In many cases, it's evidence that one crucial variable, the timing and frequency of eating and the effect that pattern has on insulin across the day, has never been properly addressed. Not because people haven't tried, but because nobody told them it mattered. The nutrient content of meals gets discussed at length. The importance of reducing sodium gets emphasized repeatedly. But the question of whether insulin ever actually falls back to baseline, whether the hormonal system ever gets the uninterrupted window it needs to recalibrate, rarely comes up at all. And yet for a very significant number of people with resistant or unexplained high blood pressure, that is precisely the missing piece. Address the signal timing, and the pressure system can finally, genuinely stand down.